Picture this. You're aboard a creaking wooden ship, the salt spray stinging your face as you clutch a carefully drawn parchment promising riches beyond imagination. You've been sailing for weeks, following coastlines that should lead to the Spice Islands of the East, when suddenly land appears where none should be. Not the familiar shores of Asia, but an entirely new continent, uncharted and overwhelming in its scale. This moment of bewildering discovery happened not once but countless times throughout history, and each time it was a map that guided explorers toward the unexpected. Maps are far more than simple directions. They are living stories of human ambition, error, and adaptation. They represent our deepest hopes and boldest guesses about the world, and sometimes those guesses turn out to be utterly, magnificently wrong. What happens when the very tool you trust to guide you reveals halfway through the journey that it has led you astray? Or worse, what if it reveals a truth so startling that it changes everything you thought you knew? This is the heart of our exploration today. 21 maps that didn't just chart geography, but altered history mid-journey, forcing not only navigators but entire civilizations to rethink their place in the world. From Ptolemy's miscalculations that launched Columbus across the Atlantic, to digital maps that now reshape how we understand pandemics and borders, these cartographic turning points reveal a profound truth. We are always navigating a world in flux, and our maps are both our guides and our questioners. Join me as we unfold these remarkable documents, each one a snapshot of a culture at a crossroads. We'll see how Norse explorers may have reached North America centuries before others claimed the New World, how a single map secretly reshaped the division of continents between empires, and how indigenous communities today are reclaiming mapping to tell their own stories. This isn't just about places, it's about people societies that faced the disorienting shock of a changed reality and found ways to adapt, survive, and even thrive. So settle in, because we're about to embark on a journey through time and space, guided by the maps that changed everything, right when we least expected it. Think of the oldest map you've ever seen, perhaps a simple drawing on a cave wall or a constellation of stars charted on ancient parchment. These were never meant to be perfect replicas of the world. Instead, they were narratives. They told stories of where to find water, where dangers lurked, or where the gods might reside. Every map, from the earliest Babylonian clay tablets to the most detailed medieval portolan charts, is a snapshot of a culture's consciousness at a specific moment in time. It captures not just geography, but also ambition, fear, and wonder. The cartographer's hand is guided by more than just measurements. It is shaped by the world view they inherit, the patrons they serve, and the myths they believe. When a medieval map places paradise at the edge of the known world, or marks a distant ocean with the warning, "Here be dragons," it is not simply making a geographical error. It is revealing a deeply held belief, a collective anxiety, or an unfulfilled desire. This is why maps are so powerful and so perilous. They present a version of reality that feels objective, yet they are saturated with subjectivity. They are tools of navigation that can also become tools of persuasion, used to justify exploration, claim territory, or even erase entire cultures from the record. The process of mapping is inherently an act of interpretation. When faced with blank spaces on the parchment, the terra incognita, the cartographer must decide how to fill that void. Some turned to the accounts of travelers, blending fact with fable. Others relied on mathematical calculations that were elegant in theory but flawed in practice. Many simply extended known coastlines into unknown waters, creating continents from conjecture. This creative filling in of the gaps means that every historical map is a palimpsest, with layers of knowledge, guesswork, and ideology waiting to be uncovered. And this is where the real drama unfolds, mid-journey. Imagine the moment a sailor, relying on a map that promises a clear passage to the Indies, instead finds themselves crashing into the coral reefs of an uncharted continent. The map has not merely failed, it has actively deceived. Yet, in that moment of crisis, it also forces a revolution in understanding. The culture that produced the map must now adapt to a new reality that contradicts its most fundamental beliefs. This adaptation is rarely smooth. It can be violent, disruptive, and deeply unsettling, but it can also be a catalyst for astonishing innovation, cultural exchange, and a broader, more humble view of humanity's place in the world. To understand cartographic evolution is to understand that maps are not finished products. They are hypotheses. They are questions posed to the universe, and sometimes the universe answers back in ways that change everything. Now consider the mind of Claudius Ptolemy, a scholar in the Great Library of Alexandria during the 2nd century. Working by lamplight, he sought to compile all geographic knowledge of the Roman world into a single, grand work he called the Geographia. His vision was breathtaking in its ambition. He didn't just draw coastlines, he introduced a grid system of longitude and latitude, a revolutionary concept that would form the very backbone of cartography for the next 1500 years. His map was a masterpiece of calculation and order, a seemingly scientific view of the world, but nestled within that precision was a critical, monumental error. Ptolemy dramatically overestimated the size of the Asian continent and, in a corresponding mistake, underestimated the circumference of the Earth itself. On his parchment, the landmass stretched so far eastward that it left a surprisingly narrow sliver of ocean between Europe's western edge and Asia's eastern fringe. This wasn't just a minor miscalculation, it was a siren's call to future adventurers, promising a much quicker westward voyage to the fabled Spice Islands than anyone had dared to imagine. For centuries, his work was preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars, while it was largely lost to a Europe mired in the Middle Ages. When it was rediscovered and translated into Latin in the early 15th century, it hit the European intellectual scene like a thunderclap. Here was ancient authority, a classical Roman scholar, providing a blueprint that suggested immense wealth was just a short sail away. This single idea, this cartographic ghost, would eventually lodge itself in the mind of an ambitious Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus. He studied Ptolemy's calculations fervently, becoming convinced that the famed Indies were within reach. Armed with this flawed ancient wisdom, he persuaded the Spanish monarchs to fund his voyage, setting sail not into the unknown, but into a reality that Ptolemy's map had confidently and utterly invented. The moment his ships made landfall in the Caribbean, the entire framework of Ptolemy's world shattered. This wasn't Asia. These weren't the lands described by Marco Polo. It was an entirely new world, a continental barrier completely absent from the maps that had guided him. The psychological impact of this discovery is hard to overstate. The most trusted geographic text for over a millennium had been proven wrong at the most fundamental level. This forced a dizzying, rapid, and often violent re-evaluation of everything. Spanish and Portuguese cultures, poised for direct trade with the East, now had to pivot entirely. Their expansionist plans were suddenly redirected from establishing trade outposts to launching massive campaigns of conquest, colonization, and resource extraction in lands they never knew existed. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the New World between these two powers, was a direct response to this cartographic shock, an attempt to impose a new order on a geography that had just dramatically expanded. Ptolemy's map, for all its errors, did not fail. It succeeded in a way he could never have anticipated. Its inaccuracies became the very catalyst for the age of exploration, proving that a powerful idea, even an incorrect one, can alter the destiny of continents and the cultures that inhabit them. Now, let's turn our attention to a map shrouded in a very different kind of mystery, one not of measurement but of authenticity. In the mid-20th century, a remarkable document surfaced, a map drawn on supposedly medieval parchment, depicting a landmass west of Greenland labeled in Latin as Vinlandia. According to Norse sagas, Vinland was the name given to a fertile region explored by Leif Erikson around the year 1000. If this map was genuine, it would be nothing short of revolutionary, offering cartographic proof that Norse explorers had not only reached North America, but had mapped it nearly 500 years before Columbus's voyage. The initial discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community. Here was a tangible artifact that could rewrite the story of European contact with the Americas, shifting the credit from Mediterranean sailors to Viking adventurers. The map was celebrated as a sensational find, a missing piece of the puzzle that perfectly aligned with the epic tales of daring voyages across the treacherous North Atlantic. It suggested a world where medieval Scandinavians possessed a geographic awareness far beyond what traditional history books had taught, hinting at a brief but significant Norse expansion that reached the fringes of a new continent. But the story of the Vinland map is a perfect example of a mid-journey controversy, where the initial revelation is followed by a long and turbulent voyage of doubt, scientific scrutiny, and heated debate. Almost as quickly as it was hailed, questions emerged. The ink used for the drawing became a central focus. Critics argued that an artificial pigment called anatase, found in the ink, was a modern 20th century product, not available to a medieval cartographer. Supporters countered that anatase could occur naturally and might have been present in medieval iron gall ink. The parchment itself, while dated by radiocarbon testing to the correct period, could have been an old blank sheet later used for a forgery. The map's content also raised eyebrows. It depicted Greenland as an island with surprising accuracy, a geographic fact not confirmed until the 19th century. Was this incredible precision a sign of lost Norse knowledge, or was it the work of a clever forger with access to modern maps? The debate has swung back and forth for decades, with each new scientific analysis often contradicting the last, leaving the map's status in an unresolved, fascinating limbo. This ongoing controversy itself teaches us a profound lesson about history and adaptation. Our understanding of the past is not fixed. It is a narrative that constantly evolves with every new piece of evidence and every new method of analysis. The map's journey from revelation to suspect artifact mirrors the very process of historical discovery, a process filled with exciting breakthroughs, disappointing setbacks, and the constant reassessment of what we think we know. Beyond the question of its authenticity, the idea of the Vinland map opens a window into a world of potential cultural encounters that history barely recorded. If Norse explorers did indeed map parts of North America, their voyages would not have been into an empty wilderness. They would have entered a world already inhabited by indigenous peoples, most likely the Thule culture, the ancestors of the modern Inuit. The Norse sagas themselves speak of these encounters, describing trade with groups they called the Skraelings, but also recounting conflicts and misunderstandings. Imagine the moment of first contact from the Inuit perspective, seeing a strange, large sailing vessel approach their shores, meeting people with different languages, technologies, and intentions. These encounters, however brief or sporadic, would have forced adaptations on both sides. The Norse, far from home in a harsh and unfamiliar environment, might have adapted their survival strategies by observing Inuit techniques for hunting, building shelters, or crafting clothing from animal skins. The Inuit, in turn, might have integrated new materials like Norse metal into their own tool-making traditions, or their oral histories might have been enriched by tales of these strange visitors from across the sea. This map, whether a genuine medieval document or an elaborate modern fake, pushes us to consider that adaptation isn't always about grand, sweeping changes imposed by empires. Sometimes it occurs in quiet, subtle exchanges on the rocky shores of a new world, where two cultures meet and, for a short time, reshape each other's understanding of what is possible. It reminds us that history is filled with quiet, unmapped connections, and that integrating foreign knowledge is one of humanity's oldest and most essential survival skills. Now, journey with me to the vibrant and intellectually curious court of King Roger II of Sicily in the 12th century. Here, in a Mediterranean crossroads where Byzantine, Norman, and Arab cultures converged, a monumental project was underway. The king, a Christian ruler known for his fascination with knowledge, commissioned a scholar named Muhammad al-Idrisi to create the most accurate map of the world ever seen. Al-Idrisi, a Muslim geographer born in North Africa and educated in Islamic Spain, brought with him the vast cartographic traditions of the Islamic Golden Age. For 15 years, they worked together, a powerful collaboration that defied the religious and political divisions of the era. The result was the Tabula Rogeriana, a massive silver planisphere, and an accompanying book of geography that represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-modern mapmaking. This was not a map drawn from superstition or guesswork. Al-Idrisi and his team synthesized the works of Greek masters like Ptolemy with the first-hand accounts of contemporary travelers, merchants, and explorers from across the Islamic world. They interviewed sailors who had sailed the African coast, cross-referenced the logs of traders who had journeyed deep into Asia, and verified distances with a meticulousness that was unprecedented. The map itself was revolutionary in its orientation. While many European maps of the time placed Jerusalem at the center with east at the top, Al-Idrisi's map was oriented with south at the top, a perspective that reflected the Islamic scholarly tradition and offered a strikingly different view of the world's layout. It depicted the entirety of the known world, from the Canary Islands in the west to the Korean Peninsula in the east, with a level of detail that would not be matched for centuries. The coastlines of the Mediterranean were rendered with astonishing accuracy. The Nile River was correctly shown with its sources in the lakes of equatorial Africa, and the map even included detailed notes on the climates, cultures, and major cities of 70 different regions. This was a living, breathing encyclopedia of global knowledge, a testament to what could be achieved when a culture prioritizes learning and inquiry above all else. The creation of the Tabula Rogeriana was only possible because of the unique cultural environment King Roger fostered in Sicily. The island was a remarkable anomaly in the medieval world, a place where Arabic was an official language of the court alongside Latin and Greek, where Muslim scholars, Jewish doctors, and Christian priests worked side by side in a spirit of intellectual curiosity. This was not a perfect utopia free from conflict, but it was a period of remarkable convivencia or coexistence where the exchange of ideas was actively encouraged. The map itself became a symbol and a tool of this exchange, by presenting a unified vision of the world that drew on the best knowledge from every available tradition. It facilitated a deeper understanding between cultures. A Sicilian merchant could use it to plan a trade mission to Alexandria, while a Muslim traveler could better navigate the routes into Europe. It showed that the world was interconnected long before the age of global shipping, and that knowledge, much like the goods traded in bustling Palermo markets, was a commodity that flowed most freely where barriers were lowest. The map forced an immediate, localized adaptation, demonstrating to everyone in Roger's diverse kingdom that wisdom was not the sole property of any one faith or people. It was a shared human inheritance. The true mid-journey shift, however, occurred centuries later when this vast repository of Islamic knowledge finally filtered into the heart of a Europe that had long been isolated from it. As European scholars during the Renaissance began to rediscover classical learning, they often did so through Latin translations of Arabic texts that had preserved and expanded upon Greek science and philosophy. The work of al-Idrisi and his peers presented a profound challenge to a Eurocentric worldview. European cartographers, who were still often relying on symbolic and theologically focused maps like the T.O. Mappa Mundi, were suddenly confronted with a sophisticated, scientific, and empirically based alternative that was hundreds of years more advanced. This forced a humbling and necessary adaptation. They could no longer view their continent as the undisputed center of the world, surrounded by a vague and frightening periphery. They had to accept that scholars from a different religious and cultural tradition possessed a superior understanding of geography. This acknowledgement was the crucial first step that made the later age of exploration possible. The detailed accounts of Africa and Asia within these Islamic texts provided the tantalizing clues about the wealth of the Indies that would eventually lure explorers like da Gama and Columbus. In this way, the Tabula Rogeriana did not just map the world, it helped reorient the European mind, bridging a cultural and intellectual divide through the universal language of cartographic innovation. It stands as a powerful reminder that our greatest leaps in understanding often come not from isolation, but from collaboration across the very boundaries that seem to divide us. Now imagine the tense, smoke-filled chambers of the Spanish court in the year 1502. A shadowy figure, likely an Italian spy known as Alberto Cantino, has just delivered a precious and highly illegal document to the Duke of Ferrara. This isn't a stolen letter or a secret treaty, but a map, the Cantino Planisphere. Its creation was an act of high-stakes espionage, commissioned to steal the most valuable secret in the world, Portugal's master map of their discoveries. For years, the Portuguese had guarded their nautical charts with a paranoid intensity, treating them as state secrets more precious than gold. Any captain caught revealing them faced the death penalty. Why such extreme measures? Because these maps were the ultimate competitive advantage in the frantic race to claim the wealth of the New World. The Cantino Planisphere was the leak to end all leaks, a beautifully detailed rendering that showed, for the very first time outside of Portugal, the true extent of their voyages. It vividly depicted the coast of Brazil, which Pedro Álvares Cabral had claimed for Portugal just 2 years earlier, and it charted the intricate journey around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, the route that had given Portugal a monopoly on the spice trade. This single piece of parchment was a snapshot of a global empire in the making, and its clandestine journey from Lisbon to Italy would forever alter the political landscape of the entire planet. The map's impact was immediate and seismic. When Spanish officials saw it, they understood the terrifying reality. Portugal was not just exploring random islands, they were systematically claiming vast, continental landmasses in what was supposed to be Spain's domain, according to earlier papal decrees. This visual evidence triggered a diplomatic crisis that could only be resolved by drawing a new line on a blank map. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas, moved slightly westward from its original proposal, which divided the entire globe along a meridian situated 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the east of this arbitrary line belonged to Portugal. Everything to the west belonged to Spain. This was the ultimate act of cartographic arrogance. Two European powers, in a room thousands of miles away, partitioning continents they had barely explored and cultures they did not understand, based on a stolen map. For the sailors, conquistadors, and merchants actually on the ground, this created an impossible situation mid-journey. A captain might be sailing along a continuous coastline, only to have to suddenly determine, using imprecise instruments, whether he had just crossed an invisible border that meant the difference between being a hero of the crown or a pirate subject to execution. Settlements were established only for later surveys to suggest they were in the wrong empire's territory, leading to decades of squabbling and military skirmishes. The map didn't bring clarity. It created a labyrinth of conflicting claims and bureaucratic chaos that had to be navigated in real time. The most profound and tragic consequences, however, were felt by the millions of people who are already living on these arbitrarily partitioned lands. For the Tupinambá people along the coast of Brazil, the Cantino map and the treaty it inspired were the first strokes of a catastrophe they could never have imagined. One day they were autonomous communities with complex social structures and deep connections to their territory. The next, they were officially deemed subjects of a distant Portuguese king. Their land was now a commodity, their forests marked for logging, their people targeted for forced labor in sugarcane plantations. They had to adapt instantly to survive this new reality, some through armed resistance, others through uneasy alliances, and many through a painful assimilation into the colonial economy that eroded their culture and way of life. A similar story unfolded thousands of miles away in the Kingdom of Congo in West-Central Africa, a sophisticated and centralized state with its own diplomats and royal court. The Portuguese, guided by their maps, entered into a trading relationship with the Manicongo, or king, initially based on mutual interest, but the logic of colonialism, justified by those very maps, quickly corrupted this exchange. The demand for enslaved labor to work Brazilian plantations turned a partnership into a predatory extraction system, fueling internal wars and devastating the region. The Congo Kingdom, which had once engaged with Europe as a sovereign power, found its autonomy systematically dismantled because a line on a map in Europe had placed it within the Portuguese sphere of influence. The Cantino Planisphere, therefore, is so much more than a beautiful artifact of exploration. It is the original blueprint for a colonial world order, a stark lesson in how political cartography can be wielded as a weapon to redraw the globe, forcing rapid and devastating cultural shifts with a stroke of the pen and utterly no regard for the lives it irrevocably changes. Just a few years after the Cantino Planisphere ignited a secret war over maps, a German cartographer working in a small town in France embarked on a project that would have a different but equally profound kind of impact. Martin Waldseemüller was not a spy or a sailor. He was a scholar, part of a circle of humanists fascinated by the flood of new geographic information coming from across the ocean. In 1507, he and his partner Matthias Ringman published a colossal world map, meant to be printed on 12 separate sheets and assembled into a wall-sized panorama of the entire known world. It was a breathtaking piece of work, incorporating the latest reports from voyages, but its true, earth-shattering innovation was a single word, printed across a vast landmass in the Western Hemisphere, America. This was not a casual choice. Waldseemüller and Ringman had been deeply impressed by the published accounts of the Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who had voyaged along the coast of South America between 1499 and 1502. Unlike Columbus, who died insisting he had found the outer islands of Asia, Vespucci posited that these lands were something entirely new, a mundus novus, or new world. This was a revolutionary idea, and the German cartographers, believing Vespucci to be the true intellectual discoverer of this new continent, chose to honor him by feminizing his first name and bestowing it upon the land. In a companion book, the Cosmography Introductio, they even explained their reasoning. Since now both Europe and Asia have received names of women, I do not see why anyone should rightly object to calling this fourth part Amerige, that is, the land of Americus or America, after its discoverer Americus. The immediate effect of this act of naming was a fundamental cognitive shift for any European who saw the map. Previously, the lands stumbled upon by Columbus were cartographic anomalies, unfortunate obstacles blocking the westward path to the Indies. They were often drawn as fragmented islands clinging to the edge of Asia. Waldseemüller's map, by stark contrast, presented them for the first time as what they truly were, a distinct continental landmass entirely separate from Asia and surrounded by its own ocean. This was the moment the New World was truly born in the European imagination. It was no longer an extension of the old. It was its own entity, a blank slate, or so the European mind perceived it, waiting to be defined, claimed, and exploited. This reclassification mid-journey was a psychological turning point of immense consequence. It transformed the project of exploration into a project of colonization. Why merely find a passage through someone else's backyard when you could own the entire backyard itself? The map didn't just record geography. It created a new geographic reality that justified and fueled centuries of imperial expansion. But of course, this blank slate was nothing of the sort. It was a world teeming with millions of people, hundreds of distinct cultures, and countless place names that had held meaning for millennia. From the Lenapehoking of the Lenape people to the Anahuac of the Mexica, from the Tawantinsuyu of the Inca to the myriad villages, rivers, and mountains that had been named and known since time immemorial, the continents were already deeply, richly mapped in oral tradition and local knowledge. Waldseemüller's act of naming was therefore an act of colossal erasure. By imposing a single European name derived from a European explorer, the map began the systematic process of overwriting indigenous identities and their deep connection to the land. This was the power of the cartographer's pen. It could make entire civilizations disappear from the global narrative, reducing their homelands to a label honoring a man who had only ever seen their shoreline. For the native cultures, adaptation to this new reality was forced upon them in the most intimate way possible through their very identity. They were now living in a place called America, a word that held no meaning in their languages and represented a foreign claim to their ancestral home. Their own toponymic heritage, the stories, histories, and spiritual beliefs embedded in their place names, was pushed aside, first on European maps and then, as colonial power grew, on the ground itself. Rivers known for generations by native names were renamed for European saints or kings. Mountains and regions were labeled after distant nobles who would never see them. This linguistic colonialism was a crucial tool of control, severing the spiritual and cultural ties between a people and their land, making it easier to justify its seizure and redistribution. The fascinating, almost ironic postscript to this story is that Waldseemüller himself seems to have had second thoughts. Later in his career, as he worked on updated editions of his maps, he began to realize that perhaps Columbus, not Vespucci, deserved the primary credit for transatlantic discovery. In a world map he produced in 1513, the name America is conspicuously absent, replaced by Terra Incognita and Terra Nova, but it was too late. The name had already taken on a life of its own, copied by other cartographers and printed in books, spreading across Europe with an unstoppable momentum. The power of the printed word, especially on a map, had proven to be irreversible. This tiny, seemingly incidental decision made in a French print shop echoes through the centuries, all the way to our modern atlases. The legacy of the Waldseemüller map is a permanent monument to the power of naming. It demonstrates that cartography is never a neutral science. It is a deeply political and cultural act. Who gets to name a place holds the power to define it, to claim its history, and to shape its future for everyone who comes after. A single word on a map can, quite literally, change the world, forging an identity for two continents that simultaneously connected them to Europe and disconnected them from the ancient cultures that knew them first. While the Cantino Planisphere was a stolen secret, its successor was a state-sanctioned masterpiece of imperial confidence, the Miller Atlas. Commissioned for King Manuel I of Portugal around 1519, this was no clandestine sketch but a lavish, breathtaking work of art and precision. Its pages, illuminated with gold leaf and vibrant colors, depicted not just coastlines but the very arteries of Portugal's burgeoning empire, the intricate, lucrative spice routes of the Indian Ocean. This atlas was the ultimate corporate strategy document, a visual declaration of Portugal's intent to control the global spice trade. For a captain like Vasco da Gama, who had already pioneered the sea route to India, such a map would have been an invaluable treasure mid-journey. Imagine him, years after his first traumatic voyage, now commanding a heavily armed fleet. He consults the Miller Atlas, tracing a finger along the meticulously drawn coast of Malabar, identifying the port of Calicut where he had once been received with suspicion. The map doesn't just show geography, it reveals the nodes of power, the rival sultanates, the wealthy Hindu kingdoms, the ports controlled by Arab traders. It transforms a vast, mysterious ocean into a navigable chessboard, and the Portuguese were arriving with a fleet of rooks and bishops ready to knock over the established pieces. The atlas's incredible accuracy was its most potent weapon. Portuguese cartographers, like the renowned Pedro Rionel and his son Jorge, who likely worked on it, had synthesized knowledge from countless sources. Their own navigators' logs, intercepted Arab maps, and the local knowledge coerced or purchased from Indian and Swahili pilots. The result was a cartographic advantage that no other power could match. The swirling currents of the Mozambique Channel were charted, the treacherous reefs near Hormuz were noted, the monsoon winds that dictated all travel in the Indian Ocean were understood and mapped. This gave Portuguese captains a terrifying confidence. They could sail into what had been for centuries a Muslim-dominated lake and operate with a brutal efficiency. Their goal was not merely trade but a complete takeover. They used their maps to locate and attack key choke points, Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, and Malacca, the fabulously wealthy gateway to the Spice Islands of Indonesia. The ancient, complex network of trade that had functioned for a millennium, where Arab dhows carried goods to Gujarat, Indian merchants supplied Malay ports, and Chinese junks sailed west, was suddenly and violently disrupted by a single-minded European power armed with superior maps and cannons. For the cultures that had built their civilizations around this trade, the arrival of the Portuguese was a cataclysm that demanded immediate and painful adaptation. The merchants of Calicut, who had grown rich on a free trade model, suddenly found themselves under bombardment from Portuguese ships demanding exclusive contracts. They had to choose between submission or finding new, overland routes to bypass the Portuguese blockade. The Sultan of Malacca, who presided over a cosmopolitan hub of tens of thousands of Chinese, Gujaratis, and Javanese, saw his city stormed and captured by Afonso de Albuquerque in 1511. Overnight, a thriving center of multicultural exchange became a fortified Portuguese colony, its trade diverted and controlled by a foreign power. Some cultures chose alliance as a strategy for survival. The kingdom of Cochin in India, a rival to Calicut, saw an opportunity in the Portuguese and allied with them, gaining a temporary upper hand against their local enemies, though ultimately becoming a client state in a larger European game. Others chose fierce resistance. The Ottoman Empire, recognizing the threat to their own economic interests, dispatched massive fleets to challenge Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean, turning these waters into a battleground between two expanding empires. The Miller Atlas, in all its beautiful, gilded detail, is the perfect symbol of this transformation. It represents the moment economic cartography became a blueprint for conquest, where the accurate drawing of a coastline was the first step toward its occupation, and where ancient commercial hubs were forced to adapt, resist, or perish under the weight of a new, globally ambitious world order. For centuries, the dominant narrative of the Age of Exploration has been a distinctly European story, a saga of bold Portuguese caravels and Spanish galleons venturing into the unknown. But what if that narrative is profoundly incomplete? Imagine a map not drawn on European parchment, but on Chinese paper, its surface alive with the bustling trade routes of the South China Sea, a document so advanced it would languish in obscurity for over 3 centuries. This is the story of the Selden Map, named for the English lawyer John Selden, who bequeathed it to Oxford's Bodleian Library in the 17th century, where it sat, misclassified and largely ignored until 2008. Its rediscovery and subsequent analysis by historian Robert Batchelor sent shockwaves through the academic world. Here was a Chinese map from the late Ming Dynasty, around 1620, that didn't depict the Middle Kingdom as the center of a Sinocentric universe. Instead, it presented something far more revolutionary, a pragmatic, detailed, and stunningly accurate chart of maritime trade routes throughout Southeast Asia, a network of commerce and connection that was the lifeblood of the region long before Europeans arrived in force. The sophistication of this map is immediately apparent. It is, in essence, a working businessman's guide to the most profitable waters on Earth. It precisely outlines the coastlines from the Philippines to Vietnam, down through the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago. But its true genius lies in the web of room lines, a series of straight lines radiating from a central compass rose that crisscross the sea. These were not theoretical constructs, they were practical sailing directions. A Chinese merchant captain could use this map to plot a course from Quanju in Fujian province to Malacca, or from Brunei to Ayutthaya in Siam, calculating distance and bearing with a confidence we previously associated only with European or Arab portolan charts. This single artifact demolishes the outdated notion that Chinese maritime activity was limited to the ceremonial voyages of Admiral Zheng He, and then abruptly ceased. The Selden Map reveals a vibrant, ongoing, and highly skilled culture of private Chinese navigation and commerce, a world of savvy merchants and seasoned pilots who knew these waters intimately. They were masterful mid-journey navigators, operating in a complex, multicultural trading world where they were central players, not passive observers waiting for the Europeans to arrive. This reality forced a continuous process of adaptation and cultural blending throughout the South China Sea. For centuries, the port cities of this region, places like Hoi and in Vietnam, Malacca in Malaysia, and Manila in the Philippines had been cosmopolitan hubs where cultures met and mingled. Chinese merchants were a permanent and influential part of this landscape. They settled in these ports, often marrying locally and acting as crucial intermediaries between their home provinces and the wider Malay and island Southeast Asian world. They adapted their business practices, their languages, and their customs to fit local contexts, creating a unique hybrid culture. In turn, local rulers and populations adapted to the Chinese presence, valuing the goods, technologies, and economic stability they brought. The intricate trade networks depicted on the Selden map were not just routes for moving silk and spices. They were conduits for the exchange of ideas, culinary traditions, religious beliefs, and artistic styles. This was a form of globalization that was organic, multipolar, and not directed by a single imperial power. The arrival of European powers, first the Portuguese, then the Spanish, Dutch, and British, injected a violent and disruptive new element into this system. The cultures of the region now faced a dual pressure: the long-standing, generally commercial influence from China, and the new, often aggressively territorial influence from the West. This forced a second, more complex wave of adaptation. Local sultanates and kingdoms had to become adept at playing these foreign powers off against each other to maintain their own autonomy. A Malay trader might now have to speak Hokkien to deal with his Chinese business partner, Portuguese to negotiate with the garrison in Malacca, and later Dutch to placate the officials of the VOC. The Selden map itself, with its precise knowledge, would have been a prize worth killing for in the boardrooms of the Dutch East India Company, a key to understanding the very networks they sought to dominate and monopolize. The map thus represents a pivotal moment caught in time, the peak of a sophisticated Asian-led trading system, just as it was on the cusp of being violently overhauled by European colonial expansion. It is a powerful testament to a road not taken, a reminder that our modern, interconnected world could have been built on a very different and perhaps more pluralistic foundation. Its quiet rediscovery challenges us to look beyond Eurocentric histories and recognize the myriad ways different cultures have mapped, navigated, and shaped our shared world. If the Cantino Planisphere was a stolen secret and the Miller Atlas a corporate strategy document, then the Bliu Atlas Maya was nothing less than a global declaration of wealth and power, a cartographic monument to an empire at its dazzling peak. Published in Amsterdam in 1662, this was not merely a book of maps. It was the largest, most lavish, and most expensive publication the 17th century world had ever seen. Its 11 volumes contained over 594 engraved maps and around 3,000 pages of text, all bound in sumptuous leather and illuminated with hand-applied gold leaf. To own a copy was to possess the ultimate symbol of status and enlightenment, a physical embodiment of the Dutch Golden Age itself. This was an era when the tiny Dutch Republic, freshly independent from Spanish rule, had somehow transformed itself into the world's dominant commercial power, its merchant fleets outnumbering those of all other European nations combined. The Atlas Maya was the visual proof of this staggering achievement, a comprehensive inventory of a global trading empire that stretched from the canals of Amsterdam to the nutmeg groves of the Banda Islands and the bustling harbor of New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan. For a Dutch merchant prince, consulting this atlas was like gazing upon a vast, interconnected web of profit, each meticulously drawn coastline representing another opportunity for wealth. The precision of these maps was not an academic exercise. It was a direct instrument of commercial and navigational control. Dutch cartographers like Willem Bliu and his son Joan, who perfected the atlas, were masters of their craft, operating at the intersection of art, science, and commerce. They incorporated the latest data from the Dutch East India Company's secretive secretessen, the locked logbooks that only senior captains and officials were allowed to see, which contained the most accurate sailing directions, depth soundings, and coastal profiles. This gave Dutch merchants an unparalleled advantage mid-journey. A captain sailing for the company could plot a course from the Cape of Good Hope to Java with a terrifying degree of confidence, his Bliu Atlas open beside him, its maps detailing not just geography but also prevailing winds, safe anchorages, and the locations of potential rivals or trading partners. This cartographic excellence lowered the immense risk of global trade, allowing the Dutch to dominate the flow of commodities that were transforming European life. It was the blue maps that guided the ships carrying cocoa from Venezuela, which would soon become a cherished drink in Amsterdam's coffeehouses, the bulbs of tulips from the Ottoman Empire, which would spark a legendary financial mania, and the priceless cargoes of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves from the East Indies that built the fortunes of Amsterdam's elegant canal houses. But this precision had a sharp, imperial edge. The same maps that guided peaceful merchants also directed the cannons of warships and the plans of colonial governors. The atlas's beautiful rendering of the Hudson River Valley, for instance, labeled it Nova Belgica, New Netherland, a claim drawn on paper long before it was fully enforced on the ground. For the Mohawk and other nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the arrival of the Dutch represented a complex new variable in their existing geopolitical landscape. They were adept diplomats and traders themselves, and they quickly recognized the value of these new partners. The Dutch offered access to highly desired European goods, particularly iron tools and firearms, in exchange for beaver pelts. This exchange forced a significant adaptation in Haudenosaunee society, integrating these new technologies into their economy and warfare, which in turn altered the balance of power among indigenous nations across the entire Northeast. Similarly, on the far side of the world, the Blue Atlas depicted the islands of Java and the Moluccas with exquisite detail, noting the very spice trees that were the source of Dutch wealth. For the Javanese kingdoms and the Bandanese islanders, the maps were a prelude to conquest. The Dutch did not come merely to trade, they came to control. They used their superior knowledge of the geography to establish fortified outposts, monopolize production, and in the case of the Banda Islands, carry out a horrific genocide and redistribution of the population to secure their nutmeg monopoly. Local cultures were forced to adapt to a brutal new economic reality where their autonomy was stripped away, and their survival became tied to the demands of a distant market. The Blue Atlas Maya, therefore, stands as a magnificent and deeply contradictory artifact. It represents the zenith of the European Enlightenment's drive to measure, categorize, and understand the world. It is a work of breathtaking beauty and intellectual ambition. Yet, it is also a stark reminder that knowledge is never neutral. In the hands of a rising imperial power, cartographic precision became a tool for economic domination and colonial subjugation, creating a forced dialogue of adaptation between the mapmakers and the map. The atlas captures a world being woven together by trade, but that tapestry was embroidered with threads of both cultural exchange and profound coercion, a dual legacy that would shape the modern world. Yet, even as these beautifully rendered maps graced the walls of European aristocrats, they set in motion a chain of events thousands of miles away that would forever alter the landscape and its people. The Beaver Map was not merely a guide, it was a catalyst, igniting and intensifying the fierce European rivalries over North American territory. The British and the French, already locked in a global struggle for supremacy, now saw the continent through a new, highly specific lens, not just as land to be claimed, but as a vast, furry bank account to be drained. The map effectively drew a new battlefield, one defined by watersheds rich with beaver colonies rather than traditional strategic strongholds. This cartographic focus transformed the nature of colonial conflict, turning the forests of the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region into a contested economic zone where control of a river system could mean a monopoly on fortune. For the trappers and traders on the ground, both European and indigenous, This meant that the political landscape could shift mid-journey with the arrival of a new map or a new treaty signed across the ocean. A French coureur des bois might find his trading license suddenly worthless because a map had placed his trapping grounds in British territory, while an English trader might be captured because he had inadvertently crossed a border that existed only on paper in a London cartographer's shop. The most profound and complex adaptations were forced upon the indigenous nations, who were not just inhabitants of this land but integral partners in the fur trade itself. For cultures like the Huron and the Iroquois Confederacy, the beaver was more than a commodity. It was woven into their spiritual and material lives. The European demand, supercharged by maps like these, fundamentally distorted these relationships. These nations were sophisticated political entities, and they initially leveraged the fur trade to their immense advantage. They understood the power dynamics at play and became masterful at navigating the rivalry between the French and British, playing one European power off against the other to secure the best prices for their furs and the most favorable military alliances. The Huron, acting as middlemen for the French, built a powerful economic network, while the Iroquois, often allied with the British, expanded their influence through both trade and warfare. However, this strategy became a dangerous balancing act. Their very success in the trade began to undermine their way of life. The intense pressure to supply more and more pelts led to the overhunting of beaver populations, disrupting the delicate ecosystems they managed sustainably for generations. As beavers were trapped out, the trappers had to move further and further into the territories of rival nations, sparking conflicts over hunting grounds that were themselves exacerbated by European map-making and territorial claims. This unsustainable harvest forced a heartbreaking series of adaptations. Some communities, facing the depletion of their primary resource and the resulting economic pressure, had no choice but to shift their entire subsistence patterns, relying more heavily on agriculture or other game, which in turn altered their seasonal movements and social structures. Others were drawn into devastating wars, like the Beaver Wars of the 17th century, where the Iroquois fought to control the flow of furs to the Europeans, displacing other nations like the Huron in a tragic cycle of violence fueled by European demand. The maps drawn in London and Paris did not just record these changes, they actively provoked them, as each new cartographic claim redrew the lines of power and conflict in a land the mapmakers themselves had never seen. The legacy of the beaver map is therefore etched into the very environment. The near extirpation of the beaver from vast regions of North America had cascading ecological consequences. Beaver dams had created wetlands that served as crucial habitats for countless species and helped regulate water tables. Their loss led to soil erosion and the alteration of entire watersheds. This early example of resource-driven colonialism demonstrates with stunning clarity that a map focused on extraction is never neutral. It is a blueprint for environmental change and social disruption, a document that can reshape a continent's ecology and force its cultures onto a perilous and unforgiving path of adaptation, where the price of a felt hat in Europe could ripple outward to change the course of lives and landscapes an ocean away. President Thomas Jefferson, a man of the Enlightenment who had never ventured west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, held a powerful and specific dream for America's future. He envisioned a nation of virtuous yeoman farmers, a vast empire of liberty stretching westward, its heartland cultivated by independent agriculturalists. To realize this vision, he needed to know what was out there. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had suddenly doubled the size of the United States, but it was a blank space on the map, a territory of rumor and legend. Jefferson dispatched his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark, a seasoned soldier and frontiersman, not just to explore, but to map this dream into existence. Their core of discovery was, in essence, a mobile cartographic workshop, equipped with the finest instruments of the day to measure, observe, and record every mile of their 2.5-year journey. The map they produced was a monumental achievement, the first detailed, scientific representation of the American West, transforming a continent of myth into a landscape of tangible geography. It showed the true, staggering scale of the Rocky Mountains, charted the complex, mighty flow of the Missouri and Columbia River systems, and documented a network of trails that had been used by native peoples for centuries. This map was the key that would unlock the West for a young, expansionist nation. Yet, mid-journey, as the rough sketches and journal entries from the expedition made their way back east, the map began to alter the very dream it was meant to serve. Jefferson's idealized vision of an easily settled, gentle landscape began to crack under the weight of geographic reality. The map revealed not a pastoral paradise, but an immense and often brutal terrain. The Rockies were not the single, low range some had hoped for, but a series of formidable, snow-capped barriers. The Great Plains were not the arid desert some feared, but they were also not the instantly fertile garden Jefferson might have wished for. They were vast, demanding, and already home to powerful, established nations. The map forced a national adaptation in ambition. The journey west would not be a simple, pastoral stroll. It would be an epic, grueling trial. The map, with its precise notations of navigable rivers and mountain passes, became the essential guide for the waves of settlers, trappers, and missionaries who followed, literally drawing the path for manifest destiny. It was a tool of incredible empowerment for expanding America, but in the same stroke, it became a blueprint for displacement. For the native cultures whose homelands were so meticulously charted, the Lewis and Clark map was not a tool of empowerment, but a herald of profound crisis. The Sioux, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, and the Mandan had known these trails and rivers for generations. Their knowledge was oral, experiential, and deeply woven into their cultural identity. Lewis and Clark themselves would have perished without the guidance and generosity of these very people, particularly the remarkable Shoshone woman Sacagawea, who acted as their interpreter and guide. The great irony is that the map which would later be used to claim their land was built upon indigenous knowledge. When this Euro-American cartographic representation was published and distributed, it effectively stripped that knowledge of its original context and ownership, repackaging it for an audience intent on settlement. The map's depiction of fertile river valleys and open plains directly invited that settlement, leading to an encroachment that was rapid, relentless, and devastating. Cultures like the Sioux, who were powerful equestrian hunters of the plains, found their hunting grounds disrupted by wagon trains and their resources depleted. They were forced to adapt to a new reality of shrinking territory, broken treaties, and ultimately, conflict and confinement on reservations. The map did not just guide explorers, it guided a tidal wave of change that demanded impossible adaptations from the original inhabitants of the land. Adding a layer of poignant tragedy to this story were the map's significant errors, which reveal how even the most scientific endeavors are filtered through a lens of hope and ambition. Perhaps the most famous cartographic ghost was their depiction of the River of the West, a mythical waterway that many, including Jefferson, believed would provide a direct, navigable passage from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. This was the geographic holy grail of the expedition. They searched for it in vain, eventually having to make a brutal, overland portage across the Rockies. Yet, the persistence of this idea shows how cartographic optimism could outpace reality. Such errors had real-world consequences. Later settlers, trusting the overall authority of the map, might set out with expectations of an easy journey, only to encounter the same harsh truths, leading to hardship, failed expeditions, and sometimes catastrophe. The Lewis and Clark map, therefore, embodies the dual nature of exploration itself, a noble pursuit of knowledge that is simultaneously an act of possession, a document of stunning accuracy built upon borrowed wisdom, and a testament to human ambition that could not help but chart its own dreams and its own illusions onto the blank spaces of the earth. While Lewis and Clark mapped a promised land of fertile potential, another explorer set out to document a landscape that defied all such agrarian fantasies. John Wesley Powell, a one-armed Civil War veteran and self-taught geologist, embarked on a journey in 1869 that was less about claiming territory and more about understanding it in its raw, unforgiving truth. His target was the last great blank space on the map of the American West, the Colorado River and the mysterious, terrifying chasm it had carved, known only through rumor as the Grand Canyon. Powell and his team of 9 men did not set out on horseback with a military escort. They plunged into the unknown in 4 wooden dories, embarking on what seemed to many a suicidal mission. Their goal was to run the violent, uncharted rapids of the Colorado and map a canyon so deep and vast that sunlight barely reached its floor. The maps they produced from that harrowing voyage were revolutionary, not because they revealed fertile valleys for settlement, but because they documented a sublime and terrifying geology that forced the nation to look at the West in an entirely new light. Powell's journey was an exercise in radical cartographic truth-telling. Prior to his expedition, the canyon was little more than a mythic barrier, a jagged scar on the landscape that travelers went miles out of their way to avoid. It was depicted on maps, if at all, as a simple hachured line, an obstruction to be circumvented. Powell's maps transformed this abstraction into a known, navigable, and profoundly complex wonder. He and his team meticulously charted every rapid, every side canyon, every layer of multicolored rock, creating the first scientific record of the canyon's immense scale and intricate structure. This was a map that didn't invite settlement, it inspired awe. It revealed a landscape defined not by soil and water for farming, but by deep time, erosion, and a powerful, indifferent river. This new understanding delivered a devastating blow to the powerful national myth of the West as an endless garden, a place where any hardy settler could stake a claim and thrive. Powell's maps showed the stark, arid reality. They illustrated a region where water was the ultimate currency, and where the vast majority of the land was simply unsuitable for the agricultural expansion that was the cornerstone of federal policy. Armed with this hard-won data, Powell became a powerful and controversial voice in Washington. He argued passionately that land laws based on the humid East were a recipe for disaster in the arid West. He proposed a radical reorganization of Western settlement based on watersheds and irrigation districts, recognizing that cooperation, not individual homesteading, was the key to survival in such a dry environment. His visionary ideas were largely ignored by a political class still invested in the myth of manifest destiny, but his maps had already begun their quiet work. They provided the foundational knowledge that would eventually lead to the creation of the U.S. Geological Survey, which Powell would lead, and later, to massive federal water projects like the Hoover Dam. The maps forced a slow but inevitable environmental reckoning, a dawning recognition that the continent's geography imposed its own immutable limits on human ambition. This cartographic revelation had immediate and profound consequences for the cultures that had called the canyon home for centuries. For the Havasupai people, whose name means people of the blue-green water, the canyon was not a wilderness to be conquered but a sacred homeland. They lived in a side canyon oasis, cultivating orchards and drawing spiritual sustenance from the majestic waterfalls and towering cliffs. Powell's maps, for all their scientific intent, became the first step toward a new kind of invasion. By making the region known and accessible, they opened the door to miners seeking copper, ranchers looking for grazing land, and eventually, tourists drawn by the very splendor Powell had documented. The Havasupai found their traditional lands and water sources increasingly encroached upon, their way of life threatened by external forces wielding maps that claimed to understand the land better than they did. Similarly, for the Hopi and other Pueblo peoples with deep cultural ties to the region, the mapping was a prelude to a loss of control. Their ancestral landscapes were now being defined, named, and managed by a distant federal government, a process that would lead to the establishment of Grand Canyon National Park and the strict regulation of access to spaces they had held sacred for a millennium. They were forced to adapt to a new reality where their homeland was becoming a spectacle for others, navigating the difficult path between preserving their culture and engaging with the tourist economy that the maps had unwittingly created. Powell's work, in its quest for pure scientific understanding, ultimately became a catalyst for both the preservation of a natural wonder and the disruption of the ancient human cultures woven into its very stone, a poignant reminder that every map, no matter how objective its intent, is drawn within a cultural context and can unleash waves of change that its creator never foresaw. Now, let us turn our attention from the awe-inspiring canyons mapped by John Wesley Powell to a very different kind of cartographic event, one that did not seek to understand a landscape, but to invent it from whole cloth. Picture a grand conference room in Berlin in the year 1884. The air is thick with cigar smoke and the quiet hum of negotiation. Around a table sit the representatives of 14 European powers, along with delegates from the United States and the Ottoman Empire. Notably absent is anyone from the continent that is the sole subject of their discussions, Africa. Over the course of several months, these men, armed with maps that were largely blank or filled with conjecture about the continent's interior, proceeded to do something of breathtaking audacity. They took out their rulers and their pens and they drew lines, straight lines, geometric lines, arcs and angles that paid no heed to the rolling hills, the winding rivers, the migratory paths of animals, or the ancient territories of countless nations and ethnic groups. This was the Berlin Conference, and the maps it produced were the ultimate expression of colonial arrogance, a declaration that the world could be remade in a European image for European convenience. The logic behind these cartographic creations was cold, simple, and utterly divorced from reality. The European powers were engaged in what became known as the scramble for Africa, a frantic race to claim territory to prevent their rivals from getting it first. The primary goal was to avoid war amongst themselves in Europe, not to create functional, sustainable states in Africa. Rivers and mountain ranges, which might have provided some logical, defensible borders, were often ignored in favor of lines of latitude and longitude that could be quickly agreed upon in a treaty. The result was a patchwork of colonies that looked orderly on a map in a London or Paris drawing room, but were catastrophic abstractions on the ground. A single, straight border might slice directly through the heart of a dense forest, divide a lake in two, or cut across a desert oasis that had been a vital stopping point for caravans for 1,000 years. This was geography not as a living system, but as a board game, and the pieces were moved with no thought for the people who lived upon them. The human cost of this cartographic arbitrariness is almost impossible to overstate. Consider the experience of a community like the Maasai, a pastoralist people whose entire culture and survival were built around seasonal migration. Their annual journey followed the rains, moving their vast herds of cattle between grazing lands in modern-day Kenya and Tanzania. The new border drawn between German East Africa and British East Africa cut directly across this migratory route. Mid-journey, a tradition that had sustained them for generations became an illegal act of cross-border trespass. They were forced to adapt to a new, impossible reality where the rhythm of their lives was suddenly in violation of laws written by strangers in a faraway capital. Similarly, the Yoruba people, with their rich cultural and linguistic unity, found themselves split between the British colony of Nigeria and the French colony of Dahomey. Families, trade networks, and religious communities were abruptly separated by a line that meant nothing to them, but everything to their new colonial administrators. Overnight, a brother might become a foreigner, a market town might lose half its customers, and a spiritual leader might be forbidden from visiting his own followers. For the European administrators sent to govern these new territories, these maps became their Bible. They arrived with their official documents and their mandate to impose order, and the first thing they did was to try and force the complex, fluid human geography of Africa to conform to the neat lines on their pages. They created arbitrary districts, imposed artificial capitals, and demanded that people identify with these new colonial constructs. This forced a process of incredibly difficult and often painful adaptation. Africans had to learn to navigate these foreign systems to survive. They became subjects of a distant queen or emperor, liable for taxes to a government they had never seen, and subject to laws that made no sense in their own cultural context. This navigation led to what scholars call cultural hybridities, new, blended forms of identity and practice. People might adopt a European language for official business while speaking their mother tongue at home, or blend Christian teachings with traditional spiritual beliefs. They learn to present themselves as compliant colonial subjects in the district commissioner's office, while maintaining their own structures of authority and community in secret. This was not assimilation. It was a strategic, often subconscious, adaptation to a system of overwhelming power, a way of preserving a core of self beneath the imposed colonial identity. The legacy of these 19th-century maps is not a historical relic. It is a living and often bloody reality. When African nations gained their independence in the mid-20th century, they largely inherited the borders drawn in Berlin. The founding principle of the Organization of African Unity was to maintain these borders, not because they were just or logical, but because to redraw them would risk unleashing unimaginable chaos and conflict. This means that today, many of the world's most intractable conflicts have their roots in those straight lines on a map. Civil wars, separatist movements, and ethnic violence can often be traced back to the fact that a single colonial territory contains rival groups who were historical enemies, or that a single ethnic group is divided across multiple nations, feeling like a marginalized minority in each. The maps of the Scramble for Africa are perhaps the most powerful and devastating example of how political cartography is never neutral. It is an exercise of power that can disrupt centuries of delicate social organization, force impossible choices upon entire populations, and create a legacy of instability that endures long after the mapmakers themselves have faded into history. For centuries, the world map that hung in virtually every classroom and office was a beautiful, elegant, and profoundly distorting lie. That map, the Mercator projection, was designed in 1569 by the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator with a very specific purpose: to help European sailors plot straight-line courses across the oceans. For navigation, it was a masterpiece, but for representing the actual size of continents, It was a catastrophe of perception. To achieve its navigational utility, the Mercator projection massively exaggerates the size of landmasses as they get farther from the equator. This means that Europe appears vastly larger than it truly is. Greenland looks to be the same size as the entire continent of Africa, when in reality, Africa is 14 times larger. India and Scandinavia appear comparable, though India is 3 times the size. This was the world we all grew up with, a world where the global north loomed large and dominant, while the global south, the so-called Third World, was shrunk down and marginalized, visually reinforcing a hierarchy of power and importance that was more colonial fantasy than geographic fact. This was the entrenched reality that a German historian and filmmaker named Arno Peters sought to dismantle. In 1974, he introduced a map that was less a new projection and more a political statement, the Peters World Map. Its central innovation was not beauty or navigational utility, but a radical commitment to what Peters called cartographic justice. It was an equal area projection, meaning that every square inch on the map represented an equal amount of land area on the globe. The result was visually jarring, even shocking to eyes accustomed to Mercator's distortions. On the Peters map, Africa and South America suddenly balloon into the long, thin giants they actually are, stretching dramatically from north to south. Europe, in stark contrast, is shrunk down to its proper, relatively modest size, nestled between the true titans of Asia and Africa. The map looked strange because it was telling the truth, and that truth directly contradicted the visual language of imperialism that had been subconsciously absorbed by generations of schoolchildren. The introduction of the Peters projection was a classic mid-journey shift in the voyage of global consciousness. For development agencies, charities, and non-governmental organizations, it was nothing short of a revelation. Groups like Oxfam and UNESCO quickly adopted it, recognizing its power as an educational tool. They understood that how we see the world shapes how we act in it. If you are trying to raise money for famine relief in Sudan, it is far more effective to show donors a map where Africa is portrayed in its true, colossal scale, rather than as a seemingly small and distant land. The Peters map forced a sudden and uncomfortable reevaluation of cultural biases. It asked viewers in Europe and North America to literally reorient their worldview, to question why their homes had been placed at the visual center of the planet and inflated in importance, while the homes of the majority of the world's population had been diminished. It was a direct challenge to the Eurocentrism baked into the most fundamental tool of geography, sparking fierce debates in cartographic circles and beyond about the very purpose of a world map. Was it to guide ships or to represent human reality? For nations and societies long shrunk on the Mercator map, the Peters projection was a powerful tool of empowerment. It offered a form of cartographic reparations. Seeing one's country rendered in its true proportion was a validating and psychologically potent experience. It provided a visual argument for a greater voice in global affairs. Diplomats from Latin American, African, and Asian nations could now point to a standard map and say, "Look at our true size, look at the sheer scale of our continent and our population." Our influence and our challenges deserve a representation that matches our reality. This new visibility was a catalyst for advocacy, fueling arguments for fairer trade terms, greater representation in international bodies, and a more equitable distribution of global resources. It was a reminder that maps are not just reflections of power, they can also be instruments for challenging it, giving a more accurate and just platform to those who had been systematically marginalized by the cartography of the past. Of course, the Peters projection was not without its own flaws and fierce critics. many professional cartographers dismissed it as a political stunt, pointing out that while it preserved area, it severely distorted shape, stretching landmasses near the equator vertically and compressing those near the poles. Some critics argued that Peters's claims of being the first equal area projection were disingenuous, noting that the Gall-Peters projection, a very similar map, had been introduced over a century earlier. The debate often grew heated, pitting the cartographic establishment, which prized technical accuracy and a variety of tools for various purposes, against social activists, who argued that the overwhelming dominance of the Mercator in public life had profound and damaging political consequences. This very controversy, however, was the point. The Peters map was never intended to be the one perfect map to rule them all. Its true purpose was to be a polemic, a protest. It succeeded magnificently by starting a global conversation that had been dormant for centuries. It forced everyone from school teachers to politicians to acknowledge that every world map is a compromise and that the choice of which compromise to make is never neutral. It is a deeply ethical decision, one that can either reinforce existing inequalities or consciously choose to dismantle them. The legacy of Arno Peters is not that we all now use his map, but that we can no longer look at any map innocently. We now understand that every projection carries a perspective, every map tells a story, and we have a responsibility to ask who that story serves and who it has left behind. But if the Peters map challenged our perception of space on a flat page, the next revolution would shatter the very idea of a map as a static object altogether. Imagine the collective gasp that rippled across the globe in 2001 when a new application landed on computer screens, offering a seemingly magical power, the ability to fly anywhere on Earth, to zoom from the cold void of space down through the clouds until you could count the cars in your own driveway. This was Google Earth, and it didn't just update cartography. It completely redefined our relationship with geography itself. For the first time in human history, high-resolution satellite imagery, once the exclusive, classified domain of governments and intelligence agencies, was placed into the hands of anyone with an internet connection. This was the ultimate act of digital democratization, a cartographic Big Bang that mid-journey transformed every global citizen from a passive reader of maps into an active explorer of the planet. The map was no longer something you simply held. It was a universe you could dive into, a living, breathing digital twin of our world that invited endless curiosity and investigation. This newfound power quickly evolved from a tool of casual exploration into a vital instrument for cultural survival and environmental defense. For indigenous communities living in the world's most remote and threatened ecosystems, Google Earth became an unexpected but powerful ally. The Saroe people in the Brazilian Amazon, for instance, faced catastrophic deforestation from illegal logging and mining incursions on their protected lands. Their traditional knowledge of the forest was profound, but it was no match against bulldozers and chainsaws operating with impunity in remote areas. Then they partnered with Google to learn how to use smartphones and the Google Earth platform. They began digitally mapping their territory, marking the locations of sacred sites, hunting grounds, and crucially fresh scars of illegal deforestation. These digital maps, backed by irrefutable satellite evidence, were then presented to the Brazilian government, leading to arrests and a significant drop in illegal activity on their land. A similar story unfolded with the Siberian Yukagir people, who used the technology to monitor the migration patterns of reindeer herds disrupted by oil and gas development, using time-lapse imagery to prove ecological damage. This adaptation was profound. Communities with ancient oral traditions were now wielding the most advanced digital cartography to defend their way of life, turning satellite surveillance, a tool often used against marginalized groups, into a powerful mechanism for their own protection and cultural preservation. The very nature of Google Earth, with its constant, real-time stream of updates, forces a pace of adaptation unlike any map that came before it. A traditional paper map is a snapshot of a moment in time, but Google Earth is a living document. A disaster response team in the Philippines doesn't consult a static map after a typhoon. They pull up the latest satellite imagery to see which roads are washed out and which villages are flooded, rerouting aid convoys in real time. Urban planners in a sprawling megacity use it to track the seemingly overnight emergence of informal settlements, forcing them to adapt their policies to the on-the-ground reality faster than any census could record. Archaeologists discover potential new sites not by trekking through deserts, but by spotting subtle, unnatural geometric patterns from space before ever setting boot on soil. This constant, flowing update cycle has fundamentally blurred the line between the cartographer and the user. We are no longer just consumers of geographic information. We are all potential contributors, adding layers of data, photos, and personal knowledge that enrich the collective understanding of a place. This is participatory mapping on a planetary scale, a collaborative project where a farmer in Kenya can mark a newly dug well and a hiker in Canada can update a trail closure, all contributing to a dynamic, ever-evolving atlas that belongs to everyone. Yet for all its digital precision, the most powerful map of the 21st century might be one that charts not the physical world, but the landscape of the human heart, the divisive and revealing cartography of a political vote. The referendum on the United Kingdom's membership in the European Union in 2016 was more than a political event. It was a national seismic shock that registered its deepest tremors not in sound waves, but in a stark, two-toned electoral map. Overnight, the familiar geography of Britain was redrawn not by cartographers, but by its own citizens, and the resulting image was a portrait of a nation split in two. The map didn't just show who voted leave or remain. It visualized a profound and often painful cultural schism between the bustling, multicultural city centers and the quieter, often overlooked countryside, between the younger generations looking outward toward a globalized future and an older generation yearning for a reclaimed past. This was a map that captured a country mid-journey in a heated argument with itself, a single snapshot that forced every citizen to confront a new and unsettling reality about their neighbors and their nation. The geographic divide was breathtakingly clear. Great swaths of the map, particularly across the English countryside and in post-industrial towns, were colored a deep blue for leave. These areas, many of which had felt the sharp end of economic decline and a sense of being left behind by the political elite in London, voted for a fundamental change to the status quo. In stark contrast, the vibrant red of the Remain vote clustered tightly in major urban centres like London, Manchester, and Edinburgh, as well as in Scotland and Northern Ireland as whole nations. This cartographic visualization did more than just tally votes. It crystallized a feeling of two different Britons existing within the same borders, one that was largely urban, connected, and internationalist in its outlook, and another that was more rural, tradition-focused, and skeptical of the benefits of globalization. For individuals on both sides, reading this map was a deeply personal experience. It forced a rapid and often painful adaptation of identity. People who had always thought of themselves as simply British now had to grapple with a new, more complicated label. Were they a leaver or a remainer? This new political geography began to influence social circles, family discussions, and even where people felt comfortable living, as the map made abstract political divisions feel tangibly, geographically real. The most significant political aftershocks, however, were felt not in England, but in the other nations of the Union. In Scotland, where every single electoral district had voted decisively to remain within the European Union, the Brexit result landed like a declaration of independence in reverse. The Scottish National Party, which had lost a referendum on Scottish independence just 2 years earlier, now found itself handed a powerful new argument. The Brexit map showed a clear divergence of political will between Scotland and England, and it fueled immediate calls for a second independence referendum. The map forced Scotland to adapt its entire political strategy, pivoting from a debate about its place in the United Kingdom to a debate about its place in Europe, arguing that it was being dragged out of the EU against its democratic will. Similarly, in Northern Ireland, the map revealed a bitter irony. The region also voted to remain, but its deepest concern was not just economic, it was about peace. The Brexit map suddenly resurrected the ghost of a hard border on the island of Ireland, a visible, militarized line that the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 had worked so hard to erase. The prospect of new customs posts and checkpoints between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland threatened not only trade but the delicate social fabric of a region built on a hard-won peace. The map forced a profound reckoning with identity for the people of Northern Ireland, challenging them to consider whether their future was more securely tied to a United Kingdom outside of Europe or to an all-Ireland economy within it. In this way, a single electoral map did more than record a vote. It became an active agent of change, amplifying separatist movements and threatening the very constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom itself, proving that a map's power lies not just in guiding us through space, but in forcing us to confront the deepest questions of who we are and where we truly belong. If the Brexit map revealed a nation divided against itself, the maps that emerged in early 2020 depicted a planet under a shared and invisible siege. As the novel coronavirus began its relentless march across the globe, our most instinctive human response was to try and see it. We turned to real-time dashboards from Johns Hopkins University and the World Health Organization, their interactive maps blooming with ominous red circles that grew in size and number by the hour. This was crisis cartography on a scale never before witnessed, a live feed of a pandemic unfolding in the public eye. These maps were our collective window onto the threat, transforming an abstract news story into a terrifyingly visual reality. A dot in Wuhan would multiply into a cluster, then a blotch that seeped across the Chinese border, sending tendrils along international flight paths to ignite new outbreaks in Milan, Madrid, and Seattle. We watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the entire map seemed to catch fire, a graphic representation of our profound global interconnectedness and our shared vulnerability. The very networks of travel and trade that had defined our modern world were now the vectors of our peril, and the map made this undeniable truth impossible to ignore. This constant, anxious cartographic surveillance forced a series of breathtakingly rapid cultural adaptations that would have been unthinkable just months before. Governments, guided by the chilling trajectories on their screens, made unprecedented mid-journey decisions. They imposed nationwide lockdowns, grounding aircraft and sealing borders, effectively halting the free movement of people in a way not seen since the age of the Black Death. The map was no longer just informational. It was instrumental, directly guiding policies that would dictate daily life for billions, and for individuals, these maps became a personal risk assessment tool. People would nervously zoom in on their own county, their own city block, watching the case counts rise, their behavior shifting with every update. A trip to the grocery store became a calculated mission, a visit to an elderly relative a potential threat. The map forced a new, hyper-local form of consciousness, where the threat was both everywhere and specifically right next door, measured in the density of dots on a screen. This was a global event experienced through the most local of lenses, a paradox made clear only through the power of digital cartography. Yet, these same maps that revealed our connections also laid bare our stark and painful inequalities. The virus, in theory, did not discriminate, but the maps showed with brutal clarity that our societies did. In dense urban centers from New York to Mumbai, the circles would glow a deep, alarming crimson, illustrating how crowded housing, essential service jobs, and multi-generational living created devastating hotspots of transmission. Zoom out, and you could see the virus hopscotch from a wealthy, globally connected capital to a remote village in the Amazon or a refugee camp in Bangladesh, places with little to no healthcare infrastructure. The map became a stark visualization of the haves and the have-nots, not in terms of wealth alone, but in terms of access to oxygen, to ICU beds, to the most basic tools of survival. This cartographic evidence of inequity sparked a dual response. In some places, it fueled fear, stigma, and a desire to build higher walls, but in many more, it prompted remarkable new forms of global and local solidarity. Communities used their own homemade maps to organize mutual aid networks, marking which households needed groceries delivered or which pharmacies still had stocks of masks. International collaborations between scientists sharing data on interactive maps accelerated vaccine development at a pace that shattered all previous records. The crisis map, in this light, was not just a tracker of doom. It became a tool for organizing compassion, a blueprint for building resilience from the ground up. Ultimately, the COVID-19 maps taught us that in the 21st century, cartography is not merely about depicting space, it is about managing time. The lag between an infection, a test, a result, and its appearance on the map was a crucial variable that governments and individuals were constantly trying to outrun. This was cartography as a real-time early warning system and a grim scorekeeper. It guided our most personal behaviors, our highest-level policies, and our most profound realizations about the world we have built. It accelerated cultural adaptations toward digital lifelines, remote work, and virtual connectivity at a rate that would have taken decades under normal circumstances, for better and for worse. The pandemic map was a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting both our fragility and our incredible capacity for innovation and empathy under pressure, proving that in moments of profound crisis, we don't just use maps to find our way, we use them to find each other and to rediscover what it means to be a global community facing a common threat. For centuries, the official maps that governed land claims and borders were drawn by colonizers, surveyors, and state powers, their lines and legends systematically erasing the deep, living connections of indigenous peoples to their ancestral territories. These maps were not just inaccurate, they were instruments of dispossession, turning homelands into empty lots ready for extraction and settlement. But in a powerful and growing movement, those same communities are now seizing the cartographer's pen or the digital stylus to tell a different story. This is the story of Indigenous Counter-Mapping, a profound act of decolonial resistance where the tools of the colonizer are being reclaimed to dismantle the very boundaries they imposed. From the dense rainforests of Guatemala to the vast, sun-baked expanses of the Australian outback, a revolutionary mid-journey shift is underway, turning maps from tools of erasure into declarations of existence. The methodology of this movement is a beautiful fusion of ancient wisdom and modern technology. It often begins not with a satellite image, but with a gathering of elders. Under the shade of a great tree or in a community longhouse, they unfold not paper charts, but the maps held in memory and story. They speak the names of places that have been silenced on official documents, recounting the trails where their ancestors hunted, the river bends where ceremonies were held, the hidden groves of medicinal plants, and the burial grounds of their grandparents. This oral geography, passed down through generations, is the foundational layer. Then, equipped with GPS units, tablets, and geographic information system software, the younger generation walks the land alongside these knowledge keepers. They physically trace these remembered paths, digitally marking each sacred spring, each historically significant rock formation, and each contested boundary that a government map has ignored. The resulting counter-map is a powerful hybrid document. Its precision is undeniable to modern courts because it uses the language of Western science, yet its soul is utterly indigenous, infused with cultural meaning, spiritual significance, and a history that long predates any colonial border. The impact of these maps in legal and political arenas has been nothing short of transformative. For the Maya communities in Guatemala's highlands, creating detailed maps of their traditional lands became a crucial weapon in their fight against massive mining and hydroelectric projects granted as concessions by the federal government without their consent. When a company arrived with a state permit to begin work, the community could present a meticulously crafted counter-map, showing not only their continuous use of the land, but also precisely how the project would desecrate specific sacred sites and disrupt vital water sources. This forced the government and corporations to engage on the community's terms, using their own cartographic language against them. It is a strategy that turns the state's obsession with territorial data into a lever for indigenous empowerment. Similarly, in Canada, the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatomi organization created the Inuit Nunangat map, which accurately delineates the 4 Inuit regions of the Arctic according to their own understanding of their homeland, challenging the standard provincial boundaries that had long fragmented their territory and ignored their sovereignty. This act of self-representation is a critical step in ongoing negotiations over land claims, resource revenue sharing, and self-governance. Beyond the courtrooms and legislative chambers, the act of counter-mapping itself is a powerful catalyst for cultural revival and intergenerational healing. The process of creating these maps becomes a communal project that strengthens cultural bonds. As elders share stories with youth to pinpoint locations, they are not just transferring data, they are revitalizing endangered languages, as many place names hold meanings and histories that are lost in translation. They are teaching traditional ecological knowledge, explaining why a certain forest must be preserved or how animal migration patterns have shifted. For communities that have suffered the trauma of displacement and forced assimilation, this process is a reclaiming of identity. It is an assertion that their way of knowing the world is not inferior to the Western scientific method, but is in fact complementary and essential for true stewardship of the land. The map becomes a living archive, an educational tool for future generations, ensuring that even if a language is fading, the knowledge of the land it describes is digitally preserved and powerfully asserted. This is cartography not as a means of control, but as an act of love, a defiant, hopeful, and resilient practice that ensures a culture's journey is not ended by the lines others have drawn, but continues on, guided by the maps they have finally made for themselves. But if counter-mapping represents a powerful reclamation of space, another form of cartography forces us to confront a terrifying loss of it. Imagine a map not of the world as it is, but of the world as it will be, a future ghost drawn in the haunting shades of rising blue. These are the climate projection maps, visualizations born from complex computer models that take the abstract, overwhelming concept of global warming and render it into a stark, undeniable reality of submerged coastlines and vanished islands. Unlike historical maps that record discoveries, these are maps of impending erasure. They show us the inexorable creep of seawater into the neighborhoods of Miami, the gradual dissolution of the Nile Delta, and the existential threat to entire island nations like the Maldives and Kiribati, where the highest point of land is often just a meter or two above the current ocean. This is cartography as a time machine in reverse, projecting a future so vividly that it demands an immediate response in the present, forcing a global conversation about sacrifice, survival, and the very meaning of home. For the cultures living on these front lines, these maps are not theoretical exercises. They are deeply personal obituaries for their homelands. In Louisiana, a state losing a football field of coastal wetlands every 100 minutes, the maps tell a story of a culture unraveling. The Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe on Isle de Jean Charles has already been designated the United States' first official climate refugees, as the land that has sustained their community for generations literally washes out from under them. Their entire way of life, intricately tied to trapping, fishing, and the seasonal rhythms of the bayou, is being severed by saltwater intrusion and land loss. The maps force upon them an impossible choice: abandon the sacred ground of their ancestors or be swallowed by the sea. Similarly, in the Maldives, an archipelago nation in the Indian Ocean, the maps paint a portrait of a national death sentence. The government has had to create sovereign wealth funds to literally purchase a new homeland for its citizens, while simultaneously launching desperate engineering projects to elevate islands and build floating cities. The maps have become the central document in a terrifyingly real strategic plan for the dissolution of a sovereign state, a modern-day Atlantis planning its own evacuation with a chilling, bureaucratic precision. This cartographic foresight, however grim, is also a powerful catalyst for innovation and a brutal form of truth-telling that is driving policy at the highest levels. In the Netherlands, a nation that has been fighting the sea for a millennium, climate maps are not about retreat but about reimagining coexistence. Their Delta Works program, a vast system of dams, sluices, and storm surge barriers, is a direct physical manifestation of a cartographic prediction, a multi-billion-dollar adaptation built in response to lines on a map. Now they are pioneering even more radical ideas, like building floating neighborhoods and designing room for the river projects that allow floodplains to expand naturally rather than trying to constrain them with ever higher levees. On the other side of the world, in Bangladesh, where millions live on the volatile river deltas, NGOs are using simplified climate risk maps to help villages develop their own adaptation plans, identifying which communities will need to be moved first and creating elevated evacuation routes. The map becomes a tool for community-led resilience, a shared visual language that allows for planning in the face of an otherwise paralyzing crisis. The most profound adaptation, however, may be a psychological and cultural one. For communities with deep, multi-generational ties to place, the loss is not just material, it is spiritual. The response involves a painful but necessary blending of ancient wisdom with cold, hard scientific data. In the Pacific Islands, where navigation and a profound connection to the ocean are central to cultural identity, elders are working with climate scientists. They are comparing their own observed changes in wave patterns, bird migrations, and weather signs knowledge passed down through chants and stories with the satellite data and projection models. This fusion creates a more nuanced, culturally grounded understanding of the threat, making the science more relatable and the necessary adaptations more palatable. It is a way of honoring the past while pragmatically facing the future, ensuring that even if the physical land is lost, the knowledge and the culture can find a way to migrate and endure. Climate change maps, in their terrifying clarity, exemplify the ultimate power and burden of cartography, to not only guide us through space but to warn us of time running out, urging a proactive, courageous, and collective response to a future that is already drawn in rising shades of blue. Now, let's journey from the intimate, community-led counter-maps of resistance to a project of almost unimaginable scale. One that uses the most advanced digital cartography not to reclaim the past, but to resurrect and supercharge it for the 21st century. Imagine the ancient Silk Road, that fabled network of trade routes that once connected the Han Dynasty in China to the Roman Empire, a web of paths trod by camel caravans carrying silk, spices, and ideas across the vast expanse of Eurasia. For centuries, it existed primarily in history books and romantic imagination. But today, that historical ghost is being given a new, digital body through intricate maps that form the backbone of China's colossal Belt and Road Initiative. This is not merely an infrastructure project. It is the greatest cartographically planned endeavor in human history, a modern mid-journey recalibration of global trade routes that is actively reshaping the destiny of over 60 nations. The maps guiding this effort are dynamic, data-rich digital dashboards, far removed from parchment or paper, but their purpose is strikingly ancient: to chart the flow of goods, capital, and influence across the same continents, creating a new dialogue between the deep past and the hyper-present. These digital maps are the central nervous system of the Belt and Road Initiative, allowing planners in Beijing to visualize and manage a mind-boggling array of projects spanning half the globe. With a click, they can track the progress of a new high-speed railway snaking through the mountains of Laos, monitor the flow of container ships from a newly built port in Pakistan, or assess the data throughput of a fiber optic cable being laid across Central Asia. This cartographic precision allows for a level of coordinated economic planning on a continental scale that was simply impossible in previous eras. The initiative's two prongs, the overland belt of roads and rail lines and the maritime road of shipping lanes and port facilities, are meticulously plotted on these interactive systems, creating a comprehensive vision of a rewired world where China sits at the center of a new global network. This is cartography as a tool of grand strategy, a way of physically drawing the world closer together according to a specific blueprint for influence and connectivity. For the cultures situated along these revived routes, this modern incarnation of the Silk Road presents a complex tapestry of opportunity and upheaval. In a country like Kazakhstan, the new railroads and highways promise to transform its economy from a landlocked nation into a vital transit hub, a central nexus in the flow of goods between China and Europe. This has sparked a surge in demand for logistics experts, multilingual translators, and construction workers, forcing a rapid adaptation of the workforce and educational systems to meet the needs of a globalized corridor. Similarly, in East Africa, the construction of a standard-gauge railway from the port of Mombasa inland to Nairobi and beyond, largely funded and built by Chinese firms, has dramatically reduced travel time and boosted trade. Kenyan merchants can now get their goods to port in hours instead of days, accessing global markets with a speed their ancestors along the old Silk Road could never have conceived. This new infrastructure acts as a powerful accelerant for local economies, creating jobs and fostering a new consumer class. Yet, this rapid modernization often arrives with its own set of cultural tensions and demands for adaptation. The influx of Chinese engineers, managers, and laborers into communities from Sri Lanka to Serbia creates new social dynamics. Small towns unaccustomed to foreign presence suddenly host large work camps, leading to a fascinating and sometimes fraught intercultural exchange. Local businesses must adapt to cater to new tastes, learning to supply ingredients for Chinese cuisine or provide services in Mandarin. There are also deeper concerns about the nature of this development. The digital maps might show efficient new highways, but they don't show the debt burdens these projects can place on host nations, leading to accusations of debt trap diplomacy. They don't show the environmental impact of a new coal-fired power plant built to fuel a manufacturing zone, or the displacement of communities to make way for a new rail corridor. The local adaptation, therefore, is not just about embracing new opportunities. It is also about navigating the power dynamics of a new form of patronage, where the lines between economic partnership and strategic dependency can become dangerously blurred. This grand project exemplifies adaptation as a continuous and multi-layered dialogue. It is a dialogue between past and future, where ancient routes of exchange are rediscovered and retraced with steel and silicon. It is a dialogue between the local and the global, where a shopkeeper in Uzbekistan might now source products directly from a factory in Guangdong through an e-commerce platform enabled by belt and road fiber optics, all while maintaining traditional craft techniques for a new tourist market drawn in by improved travel infrastructure. And it is a dialogue between resistance and acceptance, as communities and governments weigh the tangible benefits of new roads and bridges against the intangible costs to their sovereignty and cultural autonomy. The digital maps of the Belt and Road Initiative are more than just planning tools. They are the visual manifestation of this immense, ongoing negotiation. They show us a world in the process of being remade, not through sudden conquest, but through the slow, deliberate, and cartographically guided process of connection, proving once again that the most powerful maps are those that don't just guide us on a journey, but that actively reshape the very terrain through which we travel. But the maps of Mars do far more than just locate resources. They are the foundational blueprints for the most audacious engineering project ever conceived: terraforming. This is the process of deliberately altering a planet's atmosphere, temperature, and topography to make it habitable for earthly life. Cartographers and planetary scientists are already drawing theoretical maps of a future Mars, showing coastlines where today there is only barren desert, imagining vast, blue bodies of water filling the Hellas Planitia Basin, the deepest crater on the planet. These are maps of a world that does not yet exist, visualizations of a multi-century endeavor to literally build a second home for humanity from the ground up. They force us to consider the staggering ethical and practical questions of planetary-scale geoengineering. Do we have the right to reshape an entire world to suit our needs? What if microbial life exists there? These maps are not just plans, they are philosophical provocations, challenging us to define our role in the cosmos. Are we mere inhabitants of planets, or are we becoming their architects? This grand vision of transformation begins with the most immediate and practical challenge: survival. The first Martian colonies will not be lush, open-air settlements, but likely subterranean habitats or heavily reinforced surface domes designed to shield inhabitants from lethal radiation and the thin, unbreathable atmosphere. The maps guiding their construction are already being drawn, detailing not just where to land but how to build. They will pinpoint optimal locations for habitats, nestled against cliff faces for natural radiation shielding, or near subterranean lava tubes that offer pre-made caverns for expansion. They will chart the most efficient routes between the habitat, the water extraction plant at the polar ice caps, and the solar farm or nuclear power station that will provide energy. Every line on these maps represents a life support calculation, a logistical puzzle where a wrong turn or a misjudged distance could mean the difference between life and death for an entire community. This is cartography stripped down to its most essential purpose: not for exploration or conquest, but for sheer survival in the most hostile environment humans have ever attempted to call home. Within these pressurized outposts, a fascinating and unprecedented experiment in human culture will begin. Isolated from Earth by millions of miles and communication delays of up to 20 minutes, the first Martian society will be forced to adapt in ways that mirror, yet radically accelerate, the historical isolations of island or polar communities on Earth. They will develop their own unique slang, their own rituals tailored to the Martian sol, which is about 40 minutes longer than an Earth day, and their own social structures to manage the intense psychological pressure of confinement and reliance on a small group. A map of their habitat will be a map of their entire world, a tiny, fragile bubble of Earth-like environment in a vast red desert. How will governance work? Will it be a strict military-style command structure for efficiency and safety, or will it evolve into a more egalitarian, consensus-based model? The maps of their social geography, who interacts with whom, how conflicts are resolved, how scarce resources are allocated, will be just as critical as the maps of the physical terrain outside. This raises the profound question of heritage. What parts of earthly culture do the colonists take with them, and what do they leave behind? The maps they use will likely be a hybrid, overlaying new Martian place names, perhaps honoring pioneering scientists and astronauts with the nostalgic geography of home. They might name their crater New Vermont or their central habitat module Hope Town, creating a comforting linguistic bridge to a world they can see only as a pale blue star in their night sky. But over generations, as a distinct Martian identity emerges, this connection will inevitably weaken. The children born on Mars will know Earth only as a story, a place of origin, but their reality, their culture, and their very physiology may begin to adapt to the lower gravity and different conditions of their new world. The maps they draw then will be truly their own, reflecting a culture that is no longer an offshoot of Earth, but something entirely new, a human society that has completed its most profound journey yet, and in doing so, has begun the next great chapter in the story of our species, all guided by the first tentative lines we are drawing on the maps today. Consider the quiet revolution that began not on a drafting table but in our pockets and purses. It's a shift so seamless we barely notice it, activated every time we type a destination into our smartphones. This is the era of personal GPS, a technology that has fundamentally rewired not just how we navigate, but how we perceive and interact with the very space around us. We've moved from the static, premeditated world of paper road atlases to a dynamic, real-time guidance system that whispers turn-by-turn directions from our hands. This promises ultimate convenience, a world where getting lost is an antiquated concept, and the most efficient route is always just a tap away. But this extraordinary convenience comes with a subtle yet profound cultural cost. We are trading the deep cognitive engagement with our environment for a frictionless, automated passage through it, prioritizing the destination so intensely that we risk forgetting the significance of the journey itself. This constant digital guidance is leading to a widespread phenomenon known as de-skilling. Just as calculators changed our relationship to mental arithmetic, GPS is changing our innate capacity for wayfinding. We are, in a sense, outsourcing our spatial intelligence to an algorithm. Where previous generations might have developed a mental map of their city, learning the relationships between neighborhoods, the flow of main arteries, the shortcuts and dead ends, many now simply follow the blue line. This doesn't just mean we might struggle if our phone battery dies. It means we are losing a form of deep literacy with our own surroundings, without the need to pay close attention to landmarks, sun position, or the overall layout of a place. our experience of space becomes transactional and thin. We move through cities as ghosts, following a digital beacon without truly absorbing the character of the streets we traverse, the history embedded in the architecture, or the subtle cues that give a place its unique identity. The city ceases to be a living text to be read and understood, and becomes merely a pathway to be consumed. The impact of this de-skilling is felt most acutely in cultures where traditional navigation is not just a practical skill but a pillar of cultural identity. For the Polynesian voyaging society, whose ancestors navigated the vast Pacific Ocean by reading the stars, wave patterns, and bird flights, the art of wayfinding is a sacred knowledge system passed down through generations. The widespread adoption of GPS on fishing boats and inter-island ferries threatens this ancient expertise, creating a generation that may no longer see the necessity of learning to read the language of the sea and the sky. Similarly, for indigenous communities in the Australian outback or the Arctic tundra, where oral traditions and songlines have encoded navigational knowledge for millennia, the convenience of a satellite signal can inadvertently sever a vital link to ancestral wisdom. When a young person relies solely on a handheld device to traverse their own traditional lands, they miss the opportunity to learn the stories, the ecological knowledge, and the spiritual connections that are woven into every hill, river, and rock formation their ancestors named. This is more than just losing a skill. It risks eroding a fundamental part of a culture's memory and its relationship to the world. Yet, human cultures are remarkably adaptive, and a fascinating hybrid response is emerging. Rather than rejecting technology outright, many communities are finding ways to integrate digital tools with ancestral knowledge, creating a new, layered form of navigation. Inuit hunters in Nunavut, for instance, might use GPS to mark a productive sealing ground or to ensure a safe return in a sudden whiteout, but they still rely on their deep understanding of ice conditions, wind direction, and animal behavior, knowledge no satellite can provide. The digital map becomes a backup, a supplementary layer of security, while the primary navigational tool remains their own honed expertise and inherited wisdom. In this model, the technology serves the culture, not the other way around. This hybrid approach ensures that vital skills are preserved while still leveraging the safety benefits of modern tools. It represents a conscious choice to use technology without being used by it, to embrace convenience without sacrificing the deeper, more meaningful connection to place that has guided these cultures for centuries. The personal GPS map, therefore, stands as a powerful symbol of the modern condition, embodying a central tension of our technological age. It offers us unprecedented freedom from the anxiety of being lost, yet it can also foster a subtle dependency that limits our autonomy and dulls our senses. It connects us to a global network of information, yet it can disconnect us from our immediate, local environment. The blue line on our screen is a miracle of human ingenuity, a testament to our desire to master our world. But it is also a reminder that true mastery involves more than just following directions. It involves understanding, engaging with, and ultimately caring for the world through which we are passing. The most skilled navigator of the future may not be the one who never gets lost, but the one who knows when to look up from the screen and find their way by the older, deeper maps that are written on the land and in the stars. From the sprawling miscalculations of Ptolemy's ancient world to the hyper-precise, real-time guidance glowing on our smartphone screens, the journey of these 21 maps reveals a truth far greater than any single coastline or border they depict. Cartography is not and has never been a final destination. It is a perpetual state of becoming, a discipline forever mid-journey, mirroring our own unending quest to understand our place in the cosmos. Each map we've explored is a snapshot of a culture at a specific moment in time, a blend of knowledge, ambition, fear, and hope, frozen on parchment or in pixels. And time and again, that frozen moment was shattered by the arrival of new information, forcing a dramatic and often disorienting pivot. These were not merely academic corrections, they were cultural earthquakes. Societies were compelled to adapt, to rethink their economies, their political structures, their very identities, often while staring into a terrifying abyss of the unknown. The resilience displayed in these moments, from the Norse potentially integrating with new peoples in Vinland to the Inuit today using satellite imagery to defend their ancestral homes, is a testament to the incredible human capacity to not just endure change, but to forge new paths through it. As we stand on the precipice of our own uncertain future, facing cartographic challenges of a scale and complexity that would have been unimaginable to the mapmakers of old, these historical shifts offer us a crucial compass. The climate projection maps showing our cities succumbing to the seas and the digital maps of new global networks demand of us the same courage and ingenuity that defined the ages of exploration and discovery. The question is no longer about what lies over the horizon, but about how we choose to navigate toward it. Will we approach these new maps with the arrogance of a colonial power, drawing lines that serve only ourselves? Or will we embrace the collaborative, humble spirit of an al-Idrisi or the restorative justice of an indigenous counter-mapper, understanding that the truest map is one that includes all voices and honors all connections? The power of the mapmaker's pen or the coder's algorithm has never been greater, and with it comes a profound responsibility. May we wield this power not with a desire to conquer and claim, but with wisdom, empathy, and a deep reverence for the intricate, beautiful, and fragile world we are all still learning to map together. We are all still mid-journey. Your own thoughts are a vital part of this ongoing exploration, so I'd love to hear which of these 21 maps surprised or fascinated you the most. Let's continue the conversation down in the comments, and if you've enjoyed this voyage through the maps that changed our world, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the mysteries of our